I never thought one night would change the rest of my life. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to meet him. And he definitely wasn't supposed to find out who I really was. But fate doesn't care about plans. It throws you into situations that test not just your heart, but your loyalty, your strength, and your truth. My name is Ava, and this is the story of how a poor single dad saved me. And how, in return, I destroyed the one person who tried to destroy him. Let me take you back. I wasn't always Ava, the girl with a secret. I grew up in a life most people would call a dream. My father is a millionaire businessman, the kind of man whose name opens doors and whose money silences questions. From the outside, people probably thought I had everything. A mansion with golden chandeliers, luxury cars, private schools, vacations in Europe. And sure, all of that was real. But what most people didn't see was the cost. My father controlled everything. Every friendship, every decision, every dollar I ever touched. I wasn't living. I was performing in his perfect world. By the time I turned 21, I was suffocating. I wanted something real. I wanted to know what life looked like without credit cards and chauffeurs. I wanted to know what it felt like to meet someone who didn't just see me as the millionaire's daughter. So one night, after another unbearable fight with my father about who I should date and what I should study, I packed a bag, grabbed a hoodie, and slipped out of the mansion. I didn't have a plan. Just a credit card and a burning need to escape. I ended up wandering through a small town 2 hours away. It was late, cold, and the streets were empty. I told myself I'd just find a motel, but when I checked my bag, I realized I'd left the credit card on my desk in a rush. All I had was $40 in cash. Not even enough for a cheap room. I sat on a bench outside a 24-hour diner, trying not to cry. That's when he showed up. He looked exhausted, like life had been beating him down for years, but his eyes were kind. He was carrying a little boy, fast asleep on his shoulder, wrapped in a thin jacket that didn't look nearly warm enough. He noticed me shivering and hesitated, like he knew better than to talk to strangers, but then he asked softly, "You okay?" That was the first time I heard Daniel's voice. I wanted to brush him off to say I was fine, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I blurted out, "I don't have anywhere to go tonight." His eyes flickered, suspicious, cautious. I don't blame him. What single dad with a child would invite a strange girl into his life? But something in my voice must have convinced him I wasn't dangerous. He sighed, shifted his sleeping son and said, "It's just one night. You can stay at my place. Don't make me regret it." That's how I ended up in Daniel's world. His apartment was tiny. One bedroom, a cramped living room, furniture that had clearly seen better days. The carpet was stained, the walls peeling, but it felt warmer than any mansion I'd ever lived in. He laid his son, Ethan, in the bedroom, then handed me a blanket and gestured to the couch. "You can take this. I'll be on the floor." I was stunned. No man had ever put my comfort before his, not without expecting something in return. But Daniel wasn't like that. He barely even looked at me after that, just started cleaning up the living room quietly. That night, as I lay under the scratchy blanket, listening to the sound of his son breathing softly in the next room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Of course, Daniel had no idea who I was. To him, I was just a girl down on her luck. I didn't tell him about my family, my father's money, or the fact that I had a house bigger than his entire apartment building. I wanted to see how he treated me when he didn't know. And what I discovered changed everything. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Daniel was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with one hand while trying to tie Ethan's shoelaces with the other. He looked frazzled but somehow still gentle. He smiled at me awkwardly, almost shy. "Morning. Hope you like pancakes. It's all we've got." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Pancakes are perfect. That morning turned into a week. Daniel never asked me for rent, never questioned why I was there. He didn't pry into my past. He just let me exist in his small, messy, beautiful world. Ethan started calling me Ava the Helper, because I'd read him bedtime stories and help with his homework. For the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere, not as a daughter of a millionaire but as just me. But of course, secrets don't stay hidden forever. One evening while I was folding Ethan's clothes, Daniel finally asked, "So, Ava, what's your story? Nobody just wanders into town with no family, no job, nothing." His eyes weren't judgmental, but they were sharp. Panic. I wasn't ready to tell him the truth, so I lied. I told him I'd grown up poor, that my family didn't care about me, that I was just trying to make it on my own. He believed me. Or at least he pretended to. He nodded slowly, then said something that pierced straight through me. "Family isn't about money or blood. It's about who shows up when it matters." And that's when I knew. If Daniel ever found out the truth, he'd never forgive me. He'd think I was just another spoiled rich girl playing dress-up in poverty. But the truth always has a way of surfacing. And when it did, it wasn't just my secret on the line. It was Daniel's future, Ethan's happiness, and everything I had grown to care about. And that's where the revenge part comes in. Because someone found out who I really was. Someone tried to use it against me, and against Daniel. And when I realized who was behind it, I swore I wouldn't just protect Daniel. I would destroy the person who thought they could break him. The night everything started to unravel, I remember the exact sound that broke the peace in Daniel's apartment. A knock on the door. Hard, sharp, urgent. Daniel frowned, told Ethan to stay in his room, and went to answer it. Standing there was a woman I'd never seen before. Tall, sharp-dressed, her lipstick perfectly applied. She looked at Daniel with this smug expression, then turned her eyes to me. Froze. Because I recognized her immediately. Her name was Claire. My father's assistant. And if Claire was here, that meant my father knew exactly where I was. Well, Ava," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Slumming it, I see. Daddy's been worried sick. Imagine his precious daughter hiding out in a place like this." She glanced around the tiny apartment like it was crawling with disease. Daniel's eyes darted between us. "You two know each other." My throat went dry. I wanted to lie again to spin some story, but the way Claire smirked told me she wasn't going to let me off easy. "She's lying to you, Daniel," Claire said, her voice slicing through the room. "She's not some poor girl down on her luck. She's Ava Hamilton, millionaire's daughter, heiress. And trust me, she's not here because she cares about you. She's here to run from her daddy's rules." Daniel turned to me slowly. Disbelief etched all over his face. "Is that true?" I opened my mouth but no sound came out. The truth was written all over me. The clothes too clean for someone broke, the way I'd never asked for money, the fact that I avoided questions about my past. He staggered back like I'd slapped him. "You lied to me. You lied to Ethan." "Daniel, please." I started, my chest tightening. But he cut me off. "Do you know what it's like for him? To grow up with people walking out of his life. And now you're just another person pretending to care." Ethan came out of his room then, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you yelling, Daddy?" His little voice shattered me. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing calm into his voice. "Go back to bed, buddy. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. That night I slept on the couch, but not because Daniel offered it. He barely looked at me. His silence was worse than any shouting could have been. And Claire. She wasn't done. The next morning she cornered me outside the apartment. "Daddy wants you home, Ava. But me. I see an opportunity. You've gotten a little too cozy here with Mr. Struggling Single Dad. What would happen if your father knew you'd been playing house? You think he'd approve of you tarnishing his reputation like this?" I knew what she was doing. Blackmail. She wanted something and she was going to use Daniel to get it. Sure enough, a few days later, Daniel lost his job. Just like that. One day he was working late shifts at the auto shop. The next he came home with his face pale, holding a pink slip. They claimed budget cuts. But Daniel wasn't stupid. He muttered under his breath, "This doesn't make sense. I was one of the top guys there. Why would they cut me?" I knew why. Claire. My father. They were pulling strings. punishing him for taking me in. And when Ethan's school suddenly lost his scholarship paperwork, meaning Daniel had to pay full tuition he couldn't afford, it became crystal clear. Someone was deliberately trying to crush him. That was the moment the guilt inside me shifted into something sharper. Rage. Because it wasn't Daniel's fault I had shown up on his doorstep. He hadn't asked for me to stay. He hadn't asked for lies. But he and Ethan were paying the price anyway. And if my father thought he could ruin a good man's life just to drag me back into his golden cage, he was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. I remember standing in Daniel's tiny kitchen, the fridge humming quietly, Ethan's drawings taped to the wall. Daniel sat at the table with his head in his hands, bills scattered in front of him. He looked broken. And in that moment something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let them win. I was going to fight back. But I couldn't just confront my father head-on. He had money, power, connections. If I went at him blindly, he'd bury Daniel alive without blinking. I needed a plan. A way to turn his own arrogance against him. A way to make Claire regret ever underestimating me. A way to protect Daniel and Ethan. And maybe, just maybe, prove to Daniel that I wasn't the liar Claire had painted me to be. The betrayal had been exposed. The truth was out. And now the revenge was about to begin. After that night I didn't sleep. Not really. I would lie awake on the couch and watch the ceiling fan turn and think about Ethan's small face pressing into his pillow and Daniel's hands. Calloused, honest hands, shaking as he'd held that pink slip. I'd see Claire's smile, smooth as porcelain, and my father's voice in my head telling me I owed him obedience. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee and cheap detergent, and the kind of life I had pretended to understand for a few stolen days. Tasted like betrayal. Guilt folded over me first. I thought about how selfish I had been, running away from my gilded cage like a hero in some novel, never imagining that my small rebellion would land on someone else's head. I imagined my mother in some quiet room, maybe knowing, maybe not. People like us rarely have the luxury to be tender in public. And I thought about the different kinds of hunger that exist. The kind that eats your stomach and the kind that eats your pride. Daniel had both now, and it was my fault. Anger came after guilt, slow and hot. Not the cinematic kind that slams doors and breaks glass, but the precise, patient kind that sharpens your thinking. I replayed Claire's smirk, the way she'd said, slumming it, as if poverty were contagious. I replayed the boss's face when he handed Daniel the termination letter, like he'd swallowed something bitter. I replayed the counselor at Ethan's school telling Daniel that some paperwork had gone missing, and the way Daniel's smile had died a little more each time. It wasn't only revenge I wanted. It was a correction. I wanted the truth to be known, but I wanted it to land exactly where it would hurt those who had tried to break us. I knew I couldn't just storm in and scream. My father's world was noodles of influence. They pulled one string and people fell. He had lawyers, PR teams, private investigators. If I made a mistake, Daniel would be the one flattened. So I started with rules. Rules give you clarity when the world tries to drown you in emotion. Rule 1. No illegal actions. No hired hackers. No shady private investigators who'd cross a line. If I was going to topple my father's influence, I wanted it to be with evidence the world would respect, not rumors a lawyer could shred. Rule 2. Protect Daniel and Ethan first. Everything I planned had to have contingency. If a move backfired, there would be a way to shelter them, to move them quietly, and to ensure Ethan's school and healthcare weren't used as weapons again. Rule 3. Keep the circle small. Secrets spread fastest through loose lips. I trusted 3 people. Lena, my oldest friend who knew me before the diamonds and the screens. Marcus, a quiet, brilliant analyst who didn't care about social standing. And Rosa, a teacher at Ethan's school who'd become a quick friend and who understood how fragile those systems are. Rule 4. Frame the story correctly. This was not about outing anyone's sexuality. That would be cruel, irrelevant, and wrong. This was about deception, about using a public marriage and a daughter's face as camouflage so that private arrangements could benefit from public goodwill. People care when institutions they trust are misled. That's the lever I intended to use. I started small. I paid attention to the little things, the things people with power forget to hide because they think they're invisible. Claire loved parking in a particular spot outside the boutique my father favored. She used the same nail salon. She used a personal email for receipts when she wanted things off the books. If you know where to look, and I had decades of watching how my world hid itself, you can follow the breadcrumb trail. With Marcus's help, I began to assemble a timeline. He came one rainy afternoon with a thermos of coffee and settled into our tiny kitchen like a steady anchor. He showed me how to extract metadata from images, how to subpoena transactional logs without tripping obvious alarms, and how to cross-reference celebration dates with transfers. Look for patterns, he said. Not single data points. Patterns are persuasive. He put red dots and green dots on a whiteboard until the constellation of dates looked like a deliberate map. When coffee turned cold at the bottom of the mug and Lena hovered with more tissues than sympathy, we had something resembling evidence. Hotel stays keyed to dates my father said he was working, floral invoices that matched private visits, payments to a small catering service on nights Claire had been seen arriving at the boutique. Rosa, the schoolteacher, was my inside person for the community side of things. She couldn't break confidentiality, but she could tell me who from the PTA was rubbing shoulders with whom, which donors had influence, and whose board seats would be the most vulnerable if questioned. She whispered about a gala in 2 months, a small local fundraising dinner that my father had planned to grace, and pointed out the program director who prided herself on clean books. That gala would matter. It pulls out the town's heavy hitters like moths to a porch light. There were practicalities, too. I opened a bank account in a name that meant nothing to my father, deposited some cash from selling a necklace I had never wanted. Not everything I owned was glitter. Some things were investments in a strategy one hadn't named yet. Marcus helped me set up encrypted backups of everything I found. He taught me how to mirror files to cloud storage under a privacy proxy, how to create a paper trail that could be validated in court if necessary. You want this to be untouchable, he said. You want it so that if they try to gaslight you, the paperwork will be louder than the noise. Emotion remained messy. I would sometimes take Ethan to the park and watch Daniel push him on the swings and feel both joy and grief. Joy because the boy laughed like a sound could unspool the world, and grief because my choices had put that joy at risk. Daniel's trust felt like something fragile and sacred. I had lied to him. That sat in me like a burr. I rehearsed the apology I'd someday give him, if he would accept it, and the truth of what I had been, a frightened girl who'd wanted to taste the world without father's fingers on the leash. But apologies wouldn't fix the tuition invoice that had gone missing, or the boss who'd been called and told Daniel wasn't the right cultural fit. As the evidence accumulated, a plan formed that felt surgical. The aim wasn't to humiliate my father for the sake of vengeance. It was to break the mechanism he used. Influence without accountability. If I could show the systems, banks, boards, charity committees, that there was a pattern of payments and accommodations that lined up with private visits and that those private visits benefited from the public standing I provided, then those institutions would have to act. Money follows reputation. When reputation is tainted by deception, money retreats. That was the leverage. Phase 1 would be to secure Daniel's stability. I interviewed a few small non-profits under the pretense of volunteering. Lena and I met their directors and quietly asked about emergency funds, about short-term housing grants, about scholarship funds for kids like Ethan. I wasn't proud of having to leverage charity like a backdoor, but I didn't want Ethan to suffer because of my revolt. I also arranged a meeting with a small family lawyer who agreed to hold files and give advice pro bono in the event we needed to move quickly. Phase 2 would be confronting Claire and then my father, not in a roar but with documentation. I wanted the opportunity to offer them a choice. Rectify quietly and make Daniel whole, or we'd elevate the matter to those who would not be swayed by excuses. My lawyer friend, Isabel, a civil attorney Marcus knew, told me that institutions hate ambiguity. She advised sending a carefully worded letter to the board chairs and charity directors detailing the conflict of interest concerns and offering corroborative dates. That letter, in the right hands, could trigger audits and reviews. Phase 3 was the social reveal. The gala Rosa had mentioned would be my stage. I didn't want tabloids. I wanted institutional verification. I would not stand on a table and shout accusations. I would hand the facts to the people whose vote mattered: donors, board members, and legal counsel. A discreet packet with corroborated evidence, calmly presented, would do the work of spectacle far better than any outburst. Every one of these moves had a risk. If word leaked that I was the daughter of the man under scrutiny, some would cry hypocrisy. If the media reframed my actions as a spoiled heiress attacking my father for taking a stand, the narrative could flip. That's why framing mattered. All communication would emphasize systemic deception, financial irregularities, and the harm done to an innocent family, the single dad and his child, rather than focus on the titillating details of private life. I wanted accountability, not voyeurism. There were nights when I doubted myself so fiercely I thought I would dissolve. Would my father retaliate? Could he freeze bank accounts, make quiet threats that required legal armor we didn't yet have? I tried to imagine his reaction. The way he'd call in favors, the subtle power he wielded with longtime associates. Then I'd look at Ethan's drawing taped to the fridge and feel the moral clarity wash back over me. I wasn't doing this for pride. I was doing it because someone had tried to use a child as collateral in a family chess match. And that, more than anything else, felt unforgivable. So I built the scaffolding of my revenge the way you build a delicate machine. Quietly, precisely, with a team you trust and evidence you can validate. That patience felt like a kind of revenge already, because my father, for all his power, moved quickly and expected fear to do the work for him. I was taking time. I was letting the law do the heavy lifting, not the emotions. And in the silence between the plans and their execution, I rehearsed my next steps until they needed no rehearsal at all. The last thing I did before pulling anything into motion was write a note. Not for my father. Not for Claire. For Daniel. I sat at his table with a blue pen and a cheap piece of stationery and wrote the truth as simply as I could. I'm sorry. I am not proud of how this began. I will do everything I can to fix what I broke. If you want me to go, I will go. If you want me to stay, I will accept any consequence to make it right. The note felt like a small confession, a pocket of honesty in a life that had been mostly performed. Then I folded it and tucked it into the top drawer of his kitchen, where I knew he would find it not as an accusation but as an offering. For the plan I was about to set in motion would test more than my father's power. It would test Daniel's capacity to trust me again. And if I was going to ask for his forgiveness, I needed to be ready for either answer. I slept for a few hours that night because exhaustion finally crept in. When I woke, the world seemed steadier. The map of dates and receipts sat on my laptop like a promise. The gala was 6 weeks away. The school board had a meeting in 3. Claire had been trying to call, leaving messages that sounded sweeter than poison. I didn't answer. The moment of action was coming. The quiet planning had given me something my father never expected: time. And time, as I was about to show him, can be a weapon just as devastating as a checkbook. I set the pieces in motion like a pianist setting hands on the keys. Measured, rehearsed, and with the intent to make a single chord ring so true it couldn't be ignored. By now, the timeline had teeth. Hotel receipts, florist invoices, concierge notes, dates that matched board meetings and gala dinners. Marcus had converted everything into a folder that looked official enough to make people who lived by reputation sit up. Isabel had prepared the language for a demand letter that would call for transparency without sounding like a tantrum. Lena had the guest list and the names of the people who would matter most at the gala. Rosa had quietly rallied some sympathetic parents in the PTA. We were ready. The night of the gala felt surreal. I wore something quiet and elegant. No diamonds, nothing flashy. Power, I decided, was less about the sparkle and more about the calm in your voice. Daniel walked in beside me, stiff and nervous, clutching Ethan's drawing in his jacket pocket like a talisman. He'd agreed to come because he trusted me enough to know I wouldn't set him up to be a spectacle. That trust felt fragile and precious. I refused to break it. The ballroom glittered. Philanthropists in expensive suits orbited center stage like planets around a star. My father was there, tall, practiced smile, the man whose name most of these donors had learned to equate with success. He shook hands and posed for pictures. Claire fluttered at his side, immaculate and predatory in a way that made my skin prickle. When the program hit its midpoint and the speeches had started to blend into one another, Lena gave me a small nod. That was the cue. I went to the podium not as someone who wanted to yell, but as someone who wanted people to think. I offered my brief thanks about community, about childhood, and then, in the hush that followed, I said I had something personal to share. I watched faces tilt toward me. Curiosity first, then the familiar thin blade of expectation. I didn't shout accusations. I read dates and figures. I read small, unambiguous facts. I read the name of the boutique hotel and the invoice numbers that matched private nights. I read the florist bills for same-day deliveries with notes like, private suite, do not list. I read the transfers that matched rounds of trips that had been billed as work. I didn't paint anyone's private life. I framed correlation and consequence. How an image that suggested philanthropy was, in some places, being used to grease doors that should remain closed. I handed a sealed packet to a journalist I trusted and to the gala's director, and I said plainly that I expected institutional integrity to follow the facts. The effect was not cinematic fury so much as a sudden, tidal recalibration. Conversations stuttered. My father's smile slipped for the first time in years in front of a crowd that didn't know whether to look down or away. Claire's eyes narrowed as she searched for a script she could recite. The journalist's hand tightened on the packet, and the gala director excused himself to read. It was quiet and it felt enormous. Within 24 hours, the first ripples hit. An urgent board meeting request. A donor who asked to postpone a large gift pending review. A private investigator, one my father had relied on for years, calling with an odd tremor in his voice, asking if he could meet for coffee. The institutions that had once moved at a glacial pace in response to rumor now acted fast when presented with corroborated evidence. That momentum was exactly what Isabel had predicted. The law, institutions, and reputation converge in ways that money cannot always buy back instantly. My father did what powerful people do. He mobilized. PR statements. Lawyers' letters. He tried to paint my actions as a daughter's spite, as the tantrum of a young woman who wanted to embarrass him. He presented a counter-narrative on a glossy press release about family disputes and invasion of privacy. The papers printed his statement because that's what papers do. They print the cover and the counter. But the packet I had given the journalist contained dates, receipts, and corroboration the press couldn't ignore. The journalist published a careful piece that emphasized deception tied to public benefit rather than prurient gossip. The tone was sober and the facts were exhausting to argue with. As the pressure crept in, my father tried subtler maneuvers. He reached people who owed favors. He whispered in ears where influence lived. And he made offers that smelt faintly of bribes disguised as private settlements. Claire circulated carefully worded denials. He asked mutual friends to reach out to Daniel and clarify the situation. The bully behind the dinner table tried to flip the board and make me the problem. But institutions were already moving. Donors wanted distance, board chairs wanted accountability, and legal counsel who'd once smiled politely at my father's assurance started asking for backup documentation. There were shocks. A board he chaired asked him to recuse himself pending an audit. A major sponsor put a hold on funding until their due diligence concluded. A boutique investment partner withdrew an offer. Alex, no, my father, began losing the scaffolding he had used to build influence. When someone's currency is the appearance of unassailable integrity, small facts can behave like chisels. I'll be honest, watching this unfold was not all victory. Some of the consequences were raw and ugly. Old family friends who'd been complicit in some of the behavior chose to take distance. People who'd once laughed at my father's jokes stopped answering calls. That social solitude expanded. Power can give you friends who are only ever there when the lights are on. But there was a particular sweetness, quiet and precise, in seeing systems I'd once been forced to admire start to interrogate him. While the institutions did their work, I kept my eye on Daniel. I didn't want him exploited for my theater. He deserved stability, not spectacle. Isabel had arranged an emergency stabilization package in confidence. A small fund to cover the lost wages and tuition gap that had opened when Daniel lost his job and Ethan's scholarship paperwork went missing. The fund wasn't a ransom. It was a way to make sure that, no matter how hard my father fought back, the boy's nights and the man's dignity were protected. That protection meant Daniel could hold his head up while the world around him shifted. Then came Claire's unraveling. She'd always been slick, but she'd left breadcrumbs. Same salon, same parking lot, a penchant for in-person receipts that were easy to match. One of the concierge staff at the boutique hotel, prompted by a subpoena from a cautious legal counsel, found a ledger entry that listed Claire's initials beside a suite and a private service. It was so mundane and bureaucratic, the kind of paper trail administrators keep, and yet it became a linchpin. When Claire realized there was paper that tied her to the nights and the payments, she panicked. Her calls to my father changed tone. The woman who'd once sauntered into Daniel's doorway with disdain now sent frantic, awkward messages. She also tried to go public. She gave an interview to a small outlet where she painted me as a reckless social climber. But the journalist who had the packet wasn't interested in the headline, and the more Claire insisted, the more rigid the journalist's reporting became, needing receipts, needing corroboration. Claire's narrative fractured under scrutiny. She'd built a persona on polish and plausible deniability. It couldn't withstand the cold arithmetic of invoices and witness statements. And my father, he chose his next move. He could have settled quietly, made Daniel whole, and let things fade. Or he could double down. He doubled down. He mobilized a lawsuit, asserting defamation and invasion of privacy. He hired lawyers who were famous for burying critics in expense accounts and procedural paperwork. It was exactly the sort of tactic Isabel had told me to expect, the legal echo of the old guard. Drown the story in process and hope the person with less stamina caves. Instead of caving, we leaned into the process. Isabel, surprisingly serene, treated the lawsuit like a door that would open the wrong way for my father. Discovery is a blunt instrument when you have the receipts. Once lawyers start exchanging documents under oath, paper that seemed innocuous becomes testimony. She used the suit to compel the production of documents that might otherwise have been shuffled. The lawsuit, meant to intimidate me, became the vehicle by which the ledger was laid bare. There were uncomfortable moments. My father's legal team tried to paint my actions as opportunistic, as a rich girl's stunt. They hired investigators to dig into my motives. They called former friends. They searched for inconsistencies. There were whispers, online, in the corners of charity committees, in the inboxes of people who fancied themselves well-bred. The smear campaign stung. It made me question, on lonely nights, whether I'd done the right thing. But then came the deposition that would turn the tide. A hotel manager, called in under oath, authenticated reservations and explained a pattern of requests that matched our timeline. A florist owner signed an affidavit describing recurring deliveries to suites with special instructions. A mid-level accountant, uncomfortable with the pressure from superiors, quietly provided copies of transfer authorizations that pointed away from any plausible charitable intent. These were not glamorous moments. They were fluorescent-lit rooms and signatures and dry, factual language. But they were devastatingly effective. The final legal wrinkle was an agreement Isabel negotiated that was both practical and symbolic. Instead of a draconian public ruin or a private hush, the settlement required my father to make restitution that would directly benefit the people harmed, a fund to support families like Daniel's, an independent audit of certain charitable transactions, and a public acknowledgement that the appearance of philanthropy had been, in places, tied improperly to private benefit. It required Claire to step down from her role and to return certain payments, procedural things but material and public in a way that cut into reputation. When the agreement was signed, my father gave a statement that tried to retain dignity. He framed it as mistakes and private failings. He did not use words like sorry the way I wanted to hear them, but the public accounting was in place. My father's name remained known. His world wasn't obliterated. But the aura of untouchability had cracked. Contracts thinned, invites dwindled, and the quiet, unspoken privileges that once accrued to him started to require explanation. For Daniel, the effect was immediate and human. The emergency fund paid the back tuition, bought a modest used car without fanfare, and covered past due bills that had piled up like weight. The auto shop that had let him go had to answer for a dubious pattern of budget cuts, right as funds were flowing in, and a sympathetic local owner offered him a job that paid more steadily. Ethan's school reinstated the scholarship upon seeing the paperwork we'd assembled. Watching Daniel breathe again, truly breathe, felt like vindication that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with the quiet measure of a life restored. Claire left town in a way that was not cinematic. No dramatic scene, just a quiet moving van and a few boxes. She called me once from a payphone near a bus station, an odd old-fashioned gesture, and said in a voice that had once been all edges, "You were reckless." I said nothing. Reckless had been my mask when I first ran away from a life I couldn't stand. But what was reckless now was the complacency of people who believed their privilege could be hidden behind good manners. There were smaller, gentler triumphs. I anonymously seeded that scholarship fund in my old neighborhood. I met with the program director once, pretending to be a donor interested in small grants, and heard stories of kids who worked nights and took classes during the day. I listened and promised to help, and in a quiet corner of the world, an alumnus of mine got a chance. The money meant more than a headline. It meant stability for someone who otherwise might have been invisible. Not everything went away cleanly. Some relationships frayed forever. Friends who had been close to my father refused to speak to me. Some people in Daniel's orbit doubted whether a woman like me could be genuinely altruistic. They saw scandal and assumed spectacle. Those slights stung in small ways, but their pain was finite and mine was long-lived. It was a price I was willing to pay. When the dust began to settle, my life looked different. I didn't return to my old mansion as a supplicant. I had money set aside, enough to secure a life that was quietly mine. I expanded my small business. I worked with local nonprofits and quietly supported kids who needed a hand. Daniel and I, well, we tried to figure out what we meant to one another in the wake of everything. He came to meetings, he listened to depositions as a witness, and sometimes he would look at me with guarded warmth that wasn't yet trust but wasn't dismissal either. Ethan drew pictures of a house with a swing and labeled it home. That made me cry more times than I can count. Executing revenge wasn't about public humiliation. It was about dismantling a structure that used public good as a veneer for private benefit, and doing so in a way that safeguarded those who were most vulnerable. It was surgical and slow and expensive in ways that didn't show on the evening news. It was also necessary. There was a final bittersweet moment months later at a small community event, where a program director thanked a generous donor for supporting the education fund. I sat in a back row and watched Ethan run up to the front to collect a small ribbon for participation. He waved it at me as if he'd won the lottery. I cupped my hands over my mouth to hold a laugh that was half relief and half gratitude. My father, who had attended from a distance that day, caught my eye and lifted his hand in a terse nod. No words passed between us. None were needed. The ledger had been settled in the way that matters most. The children had been protected, and the unearned privileges had been attenuated. The revenge had been executed. Now all that remained was the slow, odd work of living with the consequences. When the smoke of the gala night finally settled, I felt like the world had cracked open, not with noise but with silence. Silence in my father's once unshakable office, silence in Claire's boutique that no longer attracted her circle, and silence in the phone calls that stopped coming from people who once lined up for his approval. Power, I realized, dies not with a bang but with a withdrawal. People didn't attack him. They simply stepped away, leaving him standing in the ruins of influence he thought eternal. For Daniel and Ethan, the world shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel's boss, whose hands had been tied before, suddenly found himself under scrutiny for wrongful terminations. The company reinstated Daniel's position with an apology letter so stiff and formal it felt like satire. Ethan's school not only found the missing paperwork but also granted him a scholarship through one of their community programs, as if generosity could erase their guilt. Watching Daniel read that letter, his hands trembling, was the first time I saw light return to his eyes. As for Claire, she disappeared from the social radar. The woman who once boasted about her exclusive dinner parties and glittering jewelry suddenly became a ghost. Rumors swirled. Some said she left town, others whispered that another wealthy man had cut ties. None of it mattered to me anymore. She had wielded cruelty like a weapon, and cruelty had finally cut her down. My father, he was different. He didn't yell, he didn't chase. He looked at me one day across the long oak table in his study, his eyes smaller than I'd ever remembered, and he said, "You'll regret this, Ava." It wasn't a threat. It was a lament, as if he couldn't fathom how his daughter, the child he once paraded at charity events, had dismantled the world he built. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of him. For the first time, I pitied him. Power had been his god, and I had burned the altar. Daniel found my note before I could even tell him everything. He didn't storm out, he didn't slam a door. He just came to me quietly one evening after Ethan was asleep and said, "You should have trusted me earlier." His voice broke me, not with anger but with disappointment. I confessed everything, the wealth, the lie, the reason I had run. He didn't forgive me right away. But he didn't send me away either. Instead, he said, "Trust isn't a light switch, Ava. It's a garden. You neglected it, but maybe it can grow back." Those words, "maybe it can grow back," became the soil I worked in. I cooked meals, I helped with Ethan's homework. I supported Daniel when nights of insomnia returned. Not because I was trying to buy forgiveness, but because I realized I loved them. Truly, deeply, without the armor of luxury. For the first time, my life wasn't about appearances. It was about being present, about rebuilding something fragile but real. The aftermath wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a Hollywood ending with champagne and spotlights. It was quiet mornings where Daniel handed me a cup of coffee without a word. It was Ethan leaving drawings on my pillow that said, "Ava is family." It was me walking through the city without bodyguards, without designer gowns, and realizing nobody was watching me anymore. Nobody cared. And in that invisibility I finally felt free. Did I win? In some ways, yes. My father's empire of influence cracked. The lies were exposed. Daniel's dignity was restored. But revenge, I learned, isn't about winning. It's about balance. About showing the universe that cruelty doesn't go unanswered. Still, revenge also left me with scars. I had lost whatever chance remained of reconciliation with my father. The bridge was burned, and I was the one holding the match. Sometimes late at night I wonder if I could have saved him too. But then I remember Ethan's laughter, Daniel's tired but genuine smile, and I know I chose the right side. If you're listening to my story right now, remember this. Wealth can build walls, but truth tears them down. Betrayal can wound, but it also forces you to discover your strength. And revenge. Revenge is a dangerous fire. Handle it carefully, or you'll burn yourself. For me, it lit the way to a new life. So here I am, Ava, once a runaway daughter of privilege, now simply a woman who found family in the ashes of lies. My father once told me, "Power is everything." But I've learned the real truth. Love is everything. And unlike power, love doesn't vanish when the world stops applauding.